In light of President Obama's recent announcement regarding the future of U.S. involvement in Afghanistan and the news of American soldier Bowe Bergdahl being released by the Taliban, Book TV presents portions of author talks on Afghanistan and the U.S. war there. You'll hear from a historian of Afghanistan, journalists who covered the war, and Medal of Honor recipient Dakota Meyer. You can watch all of these programs in their entirety on our website, booktv.org. We start with historian Tamim Ansary, author of Games Without Rules. In this clip, Mr. Ansary gives a brief overview of Afghanistan's history and talks about the conflicts, both external and internal, that the Afghans have experienced over the years.
I'm sure all of you are very interested in what's going on in Afghanistan right now, who is contesting for the presidential seat in the elections next year, what happens after the NATO forces withdraw, if they do. But as a historian, and we can get into all that with questions and so on, but as a historian, what I'm interested in is how we got here. And I feel that how we got here is part of the question of where do we go from here. In this book, Games Without Rules, I've gone back to what I consider the origins of the Afghan nation state, which is about 2.5 centuries ago, and I traced the narrative arc of that country, that emerging, developing country, which has still not quite developed. And I will note that the origins go back to about the same period that the United States was taking shape, late colonial area. And what I see is that in that early period, this territory that we now call Afghanistan was populated by many tribes, clans, different populations, but it was also permeated by a sense of uniformity of culture, of which Islam was perhaps the most important binding factor, but there were also values in common, a sense of common history, and something about the social structure that you would find. So that, there were various levels of power, but the people in the villages and the people in the cities and the rulers and the peasants and the poor and the rich, they might have conflicts, but they considered themselves all to be part of the same world. Then in the course of history, what happened is that a very different cultural entity suddenly appeared on the Afghan scene, and it was pressing in on this area. And these were the global powers whose culture was basically Western and who saw this territory as an important spot because of strategic considerations in their contests with each other globally. So now, for the Afghans, for anybody who was part of the ruling elite in Afghanistan or wanted to rule the country, it was necessary for them to negotiate with two very different entities. And one was the outside power, whoever that might be, the British, whatever. And then there was, the old Afghanistan, the original Afghanistan, this world of clerics and elders that came from the grassroots and the villages and the networks, the tribes. And that world still had its, the old culture that characterized the life in this area. So what I find is that over time, in the way that, if you put a liquid in a centrifuge, the heavier stuff separates from the lighter stuff, there's some sense in which Afghan society also separated into two societies. And there was this urban, westernized elite, and there was this other, inward-looking old country that was Afghanistan. And these are both Afghan, these are both aspects of Afghan society. And they're in contention and have been in contention for control of the identity of Afghanistan. So this is a story that's been going on in Afghanistan from the beginning, partly caused by the various incursions and interventions. But then there's this separate story, which is that every 40 years or so, without fail, like clockwork, well, not quite like clockwork, but about every 40 years, some foreign global power has tried to come in and dominate the Afghan scene and control it and use it for its own purposes. There have been periods of Afghan history when the rulers of Afghanistan have taken advantage of the geographical position of Afghanistan to play a sort of a neutrality card using the favoritism towards one global power, playing that against the possibility of leaning towards the other global power to keep both of them somewhat at bay. And this has been the diplomatic strategy of successful Afghan rulers whenever there have been any. And the Cold War, for example, was a notable period. Both the USSR and the United States were interested in Afghanistan. They both were competing to enlarge their influence in the country. And somehow, because of the counterbalancing of those two forces, there was a period when Afghans were sort of in control of their own destiny. And during that period, you saw modernization and change in Afghanistan that was more rapid and more sort of dramatic than you've seen anywhere, in this country. That period ended when the pendulum of trying to swing back and forth between the inner Afghanistan and the outer world, it started to swing so fast and so far that it finally crashed, and the country succumbed to a coup by the small communist group, which then quickly was followed by the Soviet invasion. And I would contend that from that day to this, we are still in the aftermath and the after effects of the Soviet invasion. The Soviet invasion pretty much destroyed the fabric of the country. You know, the 6 million refugees that it drove out of the country, the destruction of the villages, the tearing apart of the tribal structures, and the creation of a state of war in which, the old traditional Afghan systems for generating leadership gave way to a new system, which was, in that state of chaos, if you had a gun and you were good with it, you were probably going to end up being an important guy. So that, brought into being a whole other class of Afghan, leaders who are commanders. Now they call them warlords. and that entered the fray. When the Soviets left, those guys all started fighting each other, and they tore the cities apart. And then in the wake of that came the Taliban. And so now we're in the country, and I think we have come in with something of the same idea that the Soviets had, which was, this is a primitive country in a lot of trouble, and if we can restore everything and produce material benefits for the people, they will be grateful and they will come over to our side. And there's more to it than that, however. I mean, Afghans are very interested in material benefits like anyone is, but there is a question of the reconstruction of the Afghan institutions, the society, the soul, the family structure, and the reconciliation of all these contending factors on the Afghan scene. This Taliban business is not completely separate from the contentions within Afghan society over dominating the identity of Afghanistan. How much time have I used? I can keep going? All right. I was so efficient that I said almost everything I have to say. So now I could go back into all of that at great length. But I will just say this, that, I went back to Afghanistan in 2012, this last year, and part of my mission was to help a group take bare root trees to different villages and plant them. And so we went to some distance from Kabul. We didn't go to the really war-torn areas because they're war-torn. We were timid. But we went where we could, and we went, for example, to my home ancestral village near Kabul, and then we went out to Parwan and some further districts. And I saw things in Afghanistan that were interesting for me, because what I saw was, on the one hand, there were aspects of the modern world that to me were permeating to the furthest reaches of rural Afghanistan. Actually, I went to central Afghanistan where those Bamyan Buddhas used to be. You might remember those. They were destroyed by the Taliban. And then from there, we went out we wanted to see something someone told us about that was a rock structure. So that was like a couple of hours drive out of the little town of Bamyan. So we're really way out, in the middle of nowhere. And there, I look out and I see a little village clinging to the cliffs, and I see something glimmering white, and I go, what is that? So